General Petraeus is a regular guest on DW. The four-star general served in Iraq and Afghanistan and was the head of the CIA before he resigned in 2012. It's an honor to talk with him today about the war in Ukraine and the global impact in such a crucial moment. General Petraeus' national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, just said that there would be, I quote him here, catastrophic consequences for Russia if they use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. What would the consequences be?
I thought it was very heartening to hear, frankly, because what it indicates is that the U.S. and presumably our allies have been thinking this through, and more importantly, communicating with Russia that such a use of nuclear weapons would bring about this, again, catastrophic response, which I would assume would include targeting of Russian forces in Ukraine and on the Black Sea. And it would, I am quite confident, be very, very devastating to Russian forces there. Let's keep in mind as well, though, that just the cost-benefit analysis here for Vladimir Putin, who, of course, is in an incredibly desperate situation. And we can talk about that in a moment. But to use tactical nuclear weapons would actually not reverse Russia's fortunes on the battlefield. It would be very destructive, very lethal in a specific area on that battlefield, but it would not reverse this reality that confronts Russia. And that is the real new development, I think, in Ukraine, which is demonstrated by the Ukrainian successful offensive. But what is behind that is the fact that the Ukrainians have decisively won the battle of force generation. In other words, from the very beginning, they mobilized completely. And now this country of less than a third the population of Russia has a much larger army in the field in Ukraine. It is vastly better equipped. Of course, $15.1 billion worth of military hardware and ammunition and assistance from the United States alone, and plenty more from our NATO allies and other Western countries throughout the world. And now they are bringing these new forces and capabilities to bear in a very effective manner on the battlefield. There's nothing that Russia can do to reverse this situation.
General, that some people say just because of that, and as you just mentioned, because Putin might be so desperate that it could be likely that he uses nuclear weapons. Again, do you think it is likely, and what would it mean?
It is certainly a possibility. That possibility has to be taken very seriously. I don't think it is that likely, but again, something so dangerous and horrific does have to be taken seriously. Clearly, as Jake Sullivan indicated, we are taking it very seriously. And more importantly, we are communicating with Russia and with the leadership there, presumably, in a general way, what the response would be to obviously deter them, to dissuade them from taking this decision. If anything, it will unite Ukraine even more against Russia. It will unite NATO even more against Russia. It will result in additional very, very tough sanctions, financial, economic, personal. This could be the moment where Russia is finally declared a state sponsor of terror, perhaps even war crimes charges are levied against Putin. I think this takes the gloves off in terms of the Western response. This partial mobilization, what it has done is prompted demonstrations, all kinds of disruptions around Russia.
What does it mean that he's experienced such a backlash in his own country, Vladimir Putin?
Certainly this has brought out enormous demonstrations in Russia, the size that we haven't seen for a very long period of time. And of course, he feared this. This is why he hesitated as long as he did, noting that, he's already carried out three in a sense, partial mobilizations before this. They carried out one that was before the invasion for the training. They did a subsequent one, and then they had a more recent one, which struck me as just flat ludicrous. It was basically to tell every Russian republic in the Federation to provide a battalion's worth of soldiers. I mean, that's not how you create trained, equipped organized, cohesive, well-led, and so forth, capable organizations. That's sort of what we did in the Revolutionary War, in our hour of greatest need, where every town came up with its own militia. This is not how you create modern, capable combat forces. So again, he is in a very, very serious and very desperate situation. And again, I'm not sure how widespread the recognition is that this is actually irreversible for him, assuming, and it's a good assumption, that the US and other NATO and Western countries will continue to provide the very robust military support that we have been giving to Ukraine. And keep in mind—
I would like to come back to that in a minute, sir, if I might, but I would like to have one question about the so-called referenda. So the G7 already stated that they won't accept the outcome of the so-called referenda in the occupied regions in eastern Ukraine. What impact does this have on the military strategy?
None on the Ukrainian side, candidly. They are not going to acknowledge that this is part of Russia any more than they'll acknowledge that what was seized back in 2014 is part of Russia. And indeed, of course, they've conducted strikes and operations against Russian forces in Crimea, and there was no discernible response to that by Russia, as if it had been on their territory or something like that. The real issue here is, I think, that Putin wants to complete this in time for the fall conscript recruitment drive that goes on every year in Russia. And this will now be part of Russia. So now they can try to round up men of military age in these new, quote, Russian republics, or whatever they will describe them as. Again, that's not going to produce capable, well-trained, well-equipped, organized forces. It'll create more bodies, but bodies aren't how you combat a force that is now shown to be as capable and as well equipped and increasingly professional Ukrainian forces.
General Petraeus, give me some help in understanding the debate about tanks. Germany is still criticized, continuously criticized so harshly. What about France and Great Britain in that regard?
Well, the Leopard 2 is a great tank. And, it's been— the reason people buy it is because it is a terrific tank. The challenge when it comes to the M1 tank produced by the US is that it is so heavy and it is so difficult to maintain that I think there are just serious reservations that we're going to get this 70-ton plus beast. This is basically a jet engine surrounded by heavy armor with a huge cannon on it. Keep in mind, it's a 1,500 horsepower, basically jet turbine. This is not a diesel engine, traditional. And having had lots of M1s in units under my command in combat, I can tell you that the maintenance requirements are enormous. You have to have all kinds of diagnostics, very highly trained technicians, mechanics, and everything is so heavy. They're literally much heavier than any other tank in the world. So you have to then also not only do you have to have an M1 tank, you have to have an M1 tank recovery vehicle, which is, of course, on an M1 tank chassis. If it breaks out in the eastern part of the country, you're going to have to get it back out to Poland to repair it. Well, then that means you have to have a lowboy that is sufficient to carry a 70-ton tank all that distance. Do the bridges stand up to this? Can the roads take it? Again, these are the concerns, I think, when it comes to the M1. And curiously, Germany wants the US to provide just a few first so that will validate, and then they could provide theirs. I think my sense is the Leopard would be more easily maintained.
You're just coming back from Germany. If you would have met German Chancellor, or could have met German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, would you have told him, come on, send over some Leopards? Would this be your recommendation?
I would never disclose what I would say to a political leader, even as a retired four-star general.
Then let me phrase my question differently. Should Germany send Leopards to Ukraine?
Well, what I would like to see first, frankly, is scour for every T-72, T-64, T-80 that might be in the arsenals of NATO countries still, most of those have been provided to Ukraine by this point in time, but there may still be others. The Ukrainians know how to operate them, maintain them, repair them, have the ammunition for them, and all the rest of that. And then with a promise to backfill those with Leopard 2s or M1s or what have you. That, I think, is the first course of action. Let's keep in mind, by the way, that I think it is accurate to say that Ukraine has vastly more tanks now than it had at the start of the war, because it has captured about a third or more of the Russian systems that they took out. Again, I don't want to get too caught up on this particular issue, because you start to lose sight of how enormous the assistance has been. Let me give you just a tiny bit of math just about heavy artillery. So the United States alone has provided 126 155 millimeter howitzers. These are heavy artillery pieces, and trucks to carry them, because the hydraulics don't work all that well without that. Then we're providing, I think we're about 750,000 rounds of artillery at this point in time for that particular cannon. Now, you can only put about 40 to 45 rounds per 5-ton truck. So do the math and realize how many tens of thousands of trucks have to go from the border with Poland out to the east or the south just to get those to the artillery pieces. But that gives you a sense of how massive these numbers are. And again, as somebody who was part of an invasion of a country as a 2-star general and shot a fair amount of artillery and rockets and missiles, these numbers are just mind-boggling. I mean, yes, it's a very different war, to be sure, but what has been provided is just truly incredible. And a subset of both the artillery rounds and the rocket rounds that we're providing for the multiple launch rocket system we have provided are so precise that they can land on a dinner table. These rounds cost over $100,000 a piece. And I think we've provided roughly 1,000 or so of those from the artillery, and maybe a like number for the rockets. This is a subset of those because, again, the cost of these is so enormous, and our own arsenals are only so big.
Well, what does Ukraine need most right now?
Well, I think an area of real emphasis has to be additional air and ballistic missile defenses, because the one reality that is still very stark for Ukraine is that while Russia can no longer take appreciable territory and is likely to lose much, if not all, of what they have seized since 24 February, with tough fighting to be sure, what Russia can and is doing is to carry out essentially punishing strikes. They can punish Ukraine with missiles and rockets, and they have been doing that. And they're going after civilian infrastructure in particular, power generation, power transmission, even hospitals in some cases, water supplies, all of this to make life difficult, increasingly difficult for Ukrainian citizens in those areas that are within range of these different capabilities. And of course, Russia has some that are very, very long range. So that's the brutal reality for Ukraine and its leadership, just as Putin has to face this brutal reality that he's lost the fourth generation war. And the implications of that are that his forces are going to lose the vast majority, if not all, of what they have gained since 24 February. When that does take shape, I think another important element will be the NATO countries pledging to ensure the security of Ukraine, and perhaps actually inviting Ukraine to apply for membership in NATO.
Or you would recommend that Ukraine at some point should join NATO?
I think that moment is approaching. I think that, again, a lesson of this is our concern for for the Kremlin sensitivities about Ukraine being part of the West, part of a NATO alliance, the EU. We were very sensitive to that. It didn't turn out well, and we cannot allow such a situation. Again, keep in mind as well that for the success of the reconstruction of Ukraine, the success of some kind of Marshall Plan for Ukraine, there will have to be a security guarantee, or it will not it will not succeed. You will not be able to rebuild it. You certainly won't be able to attract outside investors of any size without a sense that, again, the security is going to be preserved. Keep in mind that really the most important contribution the U.S. made to the reconstruction of European countries in the wake of World War II was actually not the funding of the Marshall Plan, as important as that was, don't get me wrong, but really it was the security guarantee that the U.S. provided.
I think there is no doubt that the support from the United States, from President Biden, was outstanding. Will this change with the midterms or the possible outcome of the midterms?
No, I think it's very important to recognize that on Capitol Hill, for example, among the biggest champions of support for Ukraine is the minority leader of the Senate, Senator Mitch McConnell, a leading voice on this, together, of course, with the majority leader. But that made me very, very clearly there is strong bipartisan support. I think we may see actually a further increment of additional support. There's discussion, the rumors that perhaps Senator Lindsey Graham might be the one that champions this. He's another very strong supporter of what the White House is doing in this regard. He'd like to see them do more in some cases, to be sure. But again, you've got very, very strong support in the Senate and also in the House, in the minority parties supporting the White House in this effort. So I don't think that the midterms will change this. There will be enough support no matter who controls which house, and given President Biden still in the White House.
Do you have any estimate how long this war might go on?
There are numerous factors. One of the ones that I'm watching most closely has to do with Russian morale. Do individual soldiers, do small units, do large units surrender, melt away, collapse? This is going to be a tougher winter for the Russian soldiers than it will be for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are on their own soil with a very supportive citizenry around them doing whatever they can to support. The Russians are in areas where the citizens hate them. They're occupiers. They have brought terrible violence and destruction to the areas that they control. There are increasing actions by essentially guerrilla warfare, insurgent warfare, terrorism behind the lines. And some of them are having their tours extended. They're not even sure what they're really fighting for. The Ukrainians are fighting. This is their war of independence. The Russians, this is a war of aggression. And increasingly, they're going to hear citizens and the streets back home opposing what Putin is doing as well. So the question is, in those circumstances, given that context, given how impressive now the Ukrainian forces are doing on the battlefield, they're about to surround another important city in that nexus between Kharkiv and Luhansk, Lyman, which is a critical location, which I think the Russians will have to withdraw their forces from or lose them. As this continues, at what point do these soldiers ask whether they want to be the last person to die in this war for their country? And I just don't see the prospect that this partial mobilization is going to generate much effective combat capability, certainly not in the near term, and probably not even in the midterm. So as that realization settles in among Russian soldiers, how long can they continue to fight effectively? Do units, again, crumble and then collapse? But it's very, very hard to feel that from afar. It's actually hard even in battle. I've been in some during the fight to Baghdad where all of a sudden the enemy collapsed after several days of tough fighting. And you look back and there was no specific catalyst or action that precipitated. They just ran out of, they culminated, probably physically, mentally. When is that point? It is very difficult to say. But as that point begins to arrive, as Ukrainians achieve further success, I do think at some point there's going to have to be some move again towards discussions, towards negotiations, because at the end of the day, President Zelensky is right. The resolution will come through negotiations. But as I mentioned earlier, a critical element undergirding that, I think, will need to be a security guarantee from the West.
General Petraeus, thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to keep this conversation going. Thank you. Dankeschön.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.